you tonight, besides how to calm yourself with the breath, and I'm just going to take another deep one in, is to talk to you about grief. And my hope here tonight is that you walk away with a better understanding, not only of your own grief responses, but of those of people around you, because often we're not necessarily grieving in isolation. For example, if we've lost a parent, we may be grieving with other members of our family. If we've lost a child, we may be grieving with our spouse. And certainly if we've lost a spouse, we may be grieving with our children and their family members. And certainly we also may be grieving in a very isolated way, but important to understand not only our own reactions, but those of other people. So in terms of the objectives I have for tonight, I'd like, first of all, to cover, what is grief? What does it mean to be grieving? And what does that look like? Looking at some of the myriad of feelings that we have when we're in grief, some different symptoms, so whether they be behavioral, physical, psychological, perhaps a brief discussion of grief theory, and also, I think most importantly, a consideration of coping strategies. So how do we move through such pain? That is the million-dollar question. And finally, as Brittany mentioned, we will have time for questions at the end of the session, I hope, because we spent a little bit more time than we would have hoped getting started, but certainly I'll try and answer everything as efficiently and as comprehensively as I can. So next slide, please. So what is grief? I thought that the roller coaster imagery here was appropriate because when we're in grief, we really are going through a roller coaster of emotion, aren't we? And also, I feel sometimes like grief is something of a wild ride. Can be terrifying, can have ups and downs, and times where we feel sick and just want to get off this roller coaster of emotion that we're on. But unfortunately, grief is inevitable and one of those difficult life circumstances that most of us will need to learn how to ride through. So I've heard a lot of different analogies about grief, but this one really resonated with me. When I first started out my career as a psychotherapist, going on 10 years ago now, I actually did my master's practicum with the Beth Donovan Hospice in Kemptville. And I spent almost 3 years there. And I was counseling a couple who had lost their 18-year-old daughter to suicide. And one of the most poignant descriptions of grief that I had heard actually came from this young girl's mother. And what she said was that grief is like wandering in a foreign country with no map, no idea where you are going, and no timeline to get there. And the sense was really of being lost and wandering and searching, if you will. I simply felt that this rang so true with me, and it conveyed accurately how uncomfortable and excruciating grief can be. So I'd like really for you to conceive of grief as being the loss of an attachment. So as human beings, we attach. We are wired to do this right from infancy. And the attachments occur whether they be with other people, places, things, and ideas. But certainly our attachments in relationships are among the most profound attachments that we form. And by the way, we can attach to pets too. They can be very profound connections there. So these attachments come from the heart. And when we attach from the heart, we know that at some point, especially when it comes to the natural order of things, so thinking of our parents or our grandparents or our pets, that we will lose that attachment. Even potentially more excruciating to contemplate an out of order loss. For example, a parent losing a child or losing somebody to suicide. I'm not saying that that loss hurts less than the other losses I mentioned, but again, just this can be situations that amplify that feeling. So as inevitable as loss may be, then relatedly, we have to consider the same is true of grief. And when we lose a person that we are attached to, we move through a process called grieving. And I really want you to contemplate that grief, as I understand it, is something that we do internally. It's an internal process. It's private. Mourning, however, when we share or express our grief with others, as potentially some of us may do tonight in the breakout rooms, is external. It's something we do where we're emoting or we're sharing with other people. And so think of mourning as the social expression of grief. You know, we empathize, we talk to other people, we receive compassion, and it's really critical to understand that both grief and mourning are necessary to heal from a loss. So when we think of grieving, that private internal process that we're going through, we also need at points in time to mourn. We need both. So in sum, the more significant the loss, or the more significant potentially of the attachment, the more profound the disruption in our lives and our ability to cope. So as everyone on this call likely understands, the process of grieving can be absolutely overwhelming, bewildering. It can isolate us. It can be extremely painful. And I think most significantly, it can bring on a crisis of meaning. And what do I mean by that, a crisis of meaning? Well, a crisis of meaning is when we wonder, who am I now? Who am I without my husband, my wife, my partner, my child? You know, who am I without my sibling or my friend or my coworker, my mentor? What do I do? And this is particularly true if we've been caregiving for somebody for a while, or, you know, a lengthy period of time has been ill or it's been very dependent on us. You know, what is my purpose? Where is my place in the world? And is the world even the safe or wonderful place that I may have thought it was? Is life worth living? So these and so many other questions can arise in the aftermath of a loss. So what tends to happen after a loss is that there are parts of us that surface. In fact, they're very helpful parts that really serve to tamp down our feelings, almost like they have an anesthetic quality. And these are shock, numbness, disbelief, like how could this have happened? Denial, can't believe this has happened. And what these really do is they, as I said, they kind of suppress emotion because there's some really big distressing feelings that are often building in response to the loss. Now, this is not true of everyone. Not everybody might feel sort of in shock or surreal or numb. Some people are really in touch with their grief very keenly from the outset. But sometimes even when the death was expected, we can still be in these initial stages of, you know, what the heck has happened here? I'm just reeling. Some common feelings in grief, and I think this visual illustrates nicely. You know, we can, again, come to that, you know, denial or I'm okay, don't come near, you know, anger, you know, absolute sorrow, despair, depression, isolation. I also will mention that there's a picture of a child here, and worth mentioning that children and adolescents, for those of you who have them, do grieve very differently from adults, and they show and express their grief differently, but unfortunately that's beyond the scope of the presentation tonight, but something worth noting, especially if you want to educate yourself further, if you have little people or older children that might need some additional understanding from you. So certainly common feelings in grief connect to negative emotions, and I am sure this won't come as too much of a surprise to anyone. You know, we often feel sadness, protest, you know, it's not okay, this person is gone, missing and yearning for that person, like there's a hole in our hearts, searching for them. I think one of the fascinating things about grief is that we sometimes will feel like we're looking for that person, and we might even feel like we see them or we hear them. I remember when my grandfather passed away, he and my grandmother were married for well over 40 years. And when he used to come home, he would always announce his arrival by whistling. And I don't know if I can whistle right now, but he would make the sound. And my grandmother said, often throughout the day after he was gone, that she would listen for that whistle and sometimes even hear it. So it's quite a phenomenon that can happen. And even when I make that whistle, I can bring him and kind of conjure him easily to memory. Powerless is another feeling that some of us experience, just sort of that, I can get angry and rail at the universe, but at the end of the day, there's really nothing that I can do about what's happened, about losing my loved one, and the corresponding despair that comes with that. As well, guilt. And guilt is a very common emotion in grief. Even when we have been as perfect a support system as someone could be, this surfaces. I also hear often when I'm treating people who have lost someone to suicide, the guilt that comes. And I often think, why is it that we do this to ourselves, especially when we're already in a place of such pain? And, one of my musings is that this is potentially a way that we try and reassert control over feelings of powerlessness or helplessness. Like if we felt guilty, like we could have done something, then maybe that gives us back some semblance of control. This is somewhat speculative on my part, but something to consider. And also to understand that guilt is a sign that you have a conscience, but that often guilt can be counterproductive in such situations. So I'd like to move now to a consideration of some symptoms of grief. And, when we're in grief, something can be really scary because these symptoms are coming up. And, I've heard people say to me, like, Suzanne, I feel like I'm going crazy. I don't recognize myself. I don't recognize this other person that I know that is in grief. And, one of the things to remember is that this is common. I really like to normalize some of the common symptoms and characteristics of grief for you so that, especially if they're happening to you, to know that you're okay, that this is something that happens. So if we could just go, we're going to review physical symptoms of grief to begin. And we've already talked initially about sort of the quality of numbness, this feeling of shock that really helps us not to feel much of anything so that we can function. And maybe this is what gets us through our loved one's funeral or, difficult days just sort of organizing after they have passed. Sleep disturbance as well is very common and so tough, because if ever we needed the escape of sleep and the rest of sleep, it is when we are grieving and mourning. We just crave it. We crave just a moment of being able to forget, assuming our sleep is not plagued by bad dreams. Actually, when I was working for the Beth Donovan Hospice, I had a gentleman who participated in one of my spousal loss groups. And he said to the group, he goes, guys and gals, one of the reasons that I come to this group is because I always know I'm going to sleep well for a few days after. He goes, because I have not been able to sleep well at all since my wife died. So in his case, just having the outlet of people to talk to was enough to help his anxiety or sleep disturbance soften to a place where he could get some needed rest. Some people do need sleep medication when they are in grief. What I would say, though, is that it should regulate over time. But, if you're really suffering, or if you've gone a long time without sleep and it's really starting to impact your function, then you should certainly talk to your doctor about getting some relief, even if it's short term. Accompanying sleep disturbance can be intense fatigue or exhaustion. Very common to be exhausted after we've had a loss, especially if you've been doing some caregiving or a lot of caregiving before. And so just understanding that's part of it, as well as, headaches and all of the other symptoms that I've outlined here. Some of the more distressing ones, around dizziness or, a racing heart. If you're very concerned about these things, always, again, good to check with your doctor, because we always, feel it's wise to rule out a physiological problem before we attribute a symptom to an emotional response. So again, if you're concerned, or you're concerned about someone you love, get them to their doctor just to get checked. Another common physical symptom in grief, quite strangely, ironically, is that sometimes we can develop the same illness that our spouse had. And, whether or not we call this a mirror response or a sympathetic response does happen. And so just understand that, it's really important to take very good care of yourself after you've lost someone, because sometimes just a change in our cortisol after we've actually had the loss can allow illness to surface. So just doing what you can to nurture your body during these difficult times. Now we'll move to behavioral changes. So here, avoidance. And I often say to my clients, avoidance is a valid coping strategy. Sometimes we just don't want to face something. What I also add is avoidance is not always a good long-term coping strategy. But certainly after somebody has passed away, you could be the biggest extrovert in the world, but you might just not want to be around people because it feels overwhelming, and you may wax and wane. Sometimes you may want to be with people and sometimes you may not. Fundamentally, however, just understanding and listening to to yourself in these times and really heeding what you need. Also very common to be forgetful, disorganized, unable to concentrate. Nicole and I were chatting before, and she referred to what we call a brain fog, just really feeling out of it. And this is extremely common in grief, because basically 99% of our brain, think of it this way, is going offline. And that 99% of our brain is the part that is dealing with and processing our grief. That leaves 1% to look after everything else. And so if you're feeling so tired and overwhelmed, or you put your car keys down and you can't find them and you discover you put them in the freezer, that is grief. And so again, be patient with yourself, be patient with others. And also, for example, if you're going back to work and you're just not functioning at your, what you expect, even if work is a welcome distraction, again, understand that this is symptomatic of grief. We also see other qualities like hyperactivity. I know after my father died almost 25 years ago, I somehow decided to write something like 500 thank you notes after his funeral in about a week. And, that was purely hyperactivity. It wasn't necessary, but I welcomed the distraction at the time. So call that overwork, call it restlessness. It certainly is a sign of grief. We also see loss of libido, or in some cases, even hypersexuality. We may see substance use, either introduced or escalating. Appetite changes, Netflix, or a lot of time spent watching TV or on our phones. And, I guess one of the things I would say is that, there is nothing wrong with a glass of wine, or, watching an evening in bed, or every evening in bed, watching a movie to kind of wind down your day. Even in therapy, we sometimes feel like watching certain television shows may help sort of the person wind down, or they may find subject matter that resonates with them. But it's when it's becoming problematic, like maybe it's taking us away from things that would be good for us, or if we're drinking too much or eating too much or not enough, what feels right or wrong, or you may know what feels right or wrong for the people that that are close to you, and certainly there will be changes. But if they are chronic and persistent, then that's potentially the time to think about getting the help of a professional person such as myself, or, again, to look at other resources like bereaved families. Okay, so we'll move to psychological symptoms. Preoccupation, really feeling like all we can think about is our loved one, almost feeling obsessed with them. Very, very common. And this may persist over time. Sometimes people feel like they need to, it's 3 months later and they're still processing the loss of their spouse. Well, guess what? If you've been married to somebody for 25 years, 3 months is like 5 minutes in the big scheme of things. And, I'll get to sort of grief and timelines, but the fundamental idea here is that it takes as long as it takes to grieve someone, and that may never go away. That grief may always be sort of a constant companion in our life, and that there may always be moments of preoccupation, and to create space and understanding for that in ourselves and for other people, especially where there was a very profound attachment. We may sense our loved one's presence. I talked about my granddad. You might feel your loved one around you. And that might be very comforting. You may even have signs of their presence. And this is something that really fascinates me. I see it more as a phenomenon than a symptom of grief, but the idea that, sometimes people will see birds or a rainbow, or they will find coins, or a certain song will come on the radio that seems like it's their loved one sending a message just to them. I would say welcome those things with an open mind and an open heart. And, for those of you who are interested in that type of an exploration, in my work with clients who are grieving, I often recommend a book called Signs by Laura Lynn Jackson, which goes over that subject matter in more detail. We may also have brief dreams where our loved one comes to us in a visitation. So we see them. Often people who love to get these dreams, especially because they feel comforted or reassured. But there are other types of grief dreams that are more challenging or upsetting. We may feel irritable or angry. And this is a tough one in grief because anger usually, puts other people on the defensive. But it is a common symptom of grief and something to recognize. And maybe to have a bit more patience for if you're on the receiving end of that. It's minimizing, people saying, I'm fine, don't worry about me, I'm okay to come back to work, and meanwhile they're not. Somaticizing your grief. So all of a sudden, you might develop weird rashes, or you might have stomach pains, or just again, some kind of body expression of how you're feeling. And I've talked about overwhelm, depression, anxiety. These are all very common. And perhaps most, one of the more serious symptoms of grief is suicidal thoughts. And I actually, again, want to normalize this. When we lose somebody that is so important to us, sometimes it is very common to feel like I don't want to be here anymore without them. Life is not worth living. But feeling that way is very different from having an active plan to take one's own life. But certainly if someone is feeling sort of those passive thoughts, it's important to attend to that and understand that that's an invitation perhaps to talk more about how they're feeling and whether or not there's a more active plan to take their life. If so, again, you would bring in a professional. Okay. Mention that losses are connected. No two deaths evoke the same emotion. And one of the things in loss that we need to be prepared for is that current losses can trigger emotions connected to former losses, especially if they haven't been fully grieved. So for example, if we lost our mom, for example, 10 years ago, and now we lose our dad today, we may find grief about our mom coming up. And, a lot of unprocessed loss or trauma can surface. So just understand that you should really expect the unexpected when it comes to grief, and know that sometimes it's really like opening the proverbial Pandora's box. And again, if you find yourself in a situation where novel emotions are starting to really trouble you, that can be a time where it's really good to talk to somebody close to you that you trust, whether that be a good friend or family member or a professional. So how do we cope in the midst of all of this roller coaster of emotion? What do we do? And this is when we really need to come back to understanding grief. And I'm going to get into a bit of theory here, where I want to talk about how we as human beings process grief. And most significantly in loss, there are really two clusters of response that get triggered in us. And we go back and forth between these. So the first, and the one that's really been the focus of my presentation, is this idea of us being in loss. We are grieving, we are mourning, we are in negative emotion. But then there's another part of us that has to still deal with life. And this is the part that I call the restoration part. It could be preoccupied with, practical considerations. Like, for example, if I have a family and I lost my spouse, we have young children, I still need to take care of them, or I need to make sure they're fed and housed and get off to school. If I have elderly parents and one of them passes away, well, maybe I'm in terrible grief, but I still need to think and help my other parent. So, or I might need to go back to work. So we kind of go in and out of these things, and this can really make a person feel very conflicted internally or crazy, because it can also be that maybe I don't know, maybe I've been caregiving for a really long time, and it's 24/7 and exhausting, as some of us know, to care for somebody who's palliative. And maybe then there's a part of us that says, wow, I can actually tend to my own needs. I can have a shower, or I don't have to get up in the middle of the night. And then on the heels of that gratitude or relief, we're like, oh my God, but what I wouldn't give to be tending to that person again. How could I even be enjoying myself for 2 minutes? And so we kind of experience this internal struggle. So normal, and part of grieving. I also want to talk about grief theory in the sense that, up until I'd say about 20 years ago, grief was really seen as being stage-like, so that we went through sort of in a stepwise fashion these various stages of grief, shock, pain and guilt, anger, depression, so on and so forth, and that we had to kind of progress in a really linear way. And this really implied that there was a timeline for grief. Well, guess what? There is no timeline for grief. Remember that statement I made at the beginning. Grief is like wandering in a foreign country with no map and no idea how long it's going to take to where you're going. And you don't even know where you're going. So what I can tell you is that there are common emotions and common symptoms, as we've just gone over in grief. And we certainly may find ourselves in various places at different times. And we can also get stuck in places. So we can get stuck in anger, we can get stuck in sorrow. But more often than not, we are moving in and out. And as we progress and process our grief, we hopefully will find ourselves less in grief and more in that restoration phase. Okay, great, thank you. So we also know now that each person experiences the same loss very differently, even if it's in the same family. So each stage or emotion attached to grief is not discrete and disconnected. For example, you may be the type of person that likes to talk about your feelings and grief, and Your sister who lost the same parent might just not want to talk at all. And this actually can create a fair amount of conflict in families or in grieving styles if they're not compatible. So something to consider as well if you're grieving alongside somebody else. We also know that grief does not necessarily have an endpoint, and I alluded to this earlier. Essentially, we know that we could be feeling better, we could be spending less time in grief, and then we could have what I have termed a stug, or actually not me, I think somebody else coined that term. I don't want to take credit where it's not due. A stug is basically what is referred to as a subsequent temporary upsurge in grief. So in other words, we could be just fine and a song could come on that reminds us of the person we love, and we could just find ourselves a basket case, just a mess. Or we could be going along just fine and perhaps a birthday comes up or an anniversary or a holiday, and we are just right back in it. And that does not mean you are having a setback. That is part of grief. And everybody's a snowflake. And if that happens, even if it's 5 years from now, let it happen. Don't judge. Okay. So I now like to get to coping strategies, and I'm mindful that we only have about 10 minutes left, and I don't want to take too much time. So I apologize if I'm going over this a little quickly, because in some ways this is probably one of the most important elements of the presentation. But what I can tell you is there are several things we can do. And the first thing to do is to name it. So in other words, if you are finding that you are angry or you are upset, or you are not sleeping, name it as grief. I am grieving, and validate that. It's okay that this is happening, and hold that compassion for yourself. The same compassion you would give to others, you deserve that too, without judgment. Avoiding comparisons. So again, as I said, we're all snowflakes, and the way you grieve is not the same way someone else grieves, and there's no right way to grieve. And so understanding also that when other people may judge you for how you're grieving, they are potentially comparing you to their own style, and maybe that's just a moment to have a talk with them about how you're feeling and how you process grief, so that would maybe invite some more understanding on their part. Routine, setting some boundaries. I mentioned 99% of our brain is offline when we're in grief, and that might seem dramatic, but in my experience, it's very true, especially in early days or early moments of grief. And so letting people know, no, I don't want 10,000 people in my house right now, or yes, I do want 10,000 people in my house right now. We may decline invitations at certain points in time because we're just not up for it, even if it's important to somebody else. Most important to honor ourselves in grief, and again, to have compassion for when we're there. In terms of self-care, forgive me, I feel that's a really overused term, and it's also a term sometimes that brings a lot of pressure. Especially, for example, if we've forgotten how to do that because we've been looking after somebody else for so long. By definition, I believe that self-care is the practice of taking an active role in protecting your own well-being and happiness, particularly during periods of stress. And so my thought here is, it's kind of like that old adage of, needing to put that oxygen mask on ourselves first before we give it to somebody else. My suggestion is simply that even if it's 10, 15 minutes, just some time to kind of regroup, take that breath that I showed you at the beginning of the presentation, be so helpful. Mourning, as I've mentioned, sharing our grief with others, especially if they are compassionate others, people who, as Brittany suggested at the beginning, and what we'll be doing, or what you'll be doing in your support groups, is listening without advice. No, you should do this. Why don't you try that? Not taking that, but just simply having somebody who's a compassionate witness to what you're dealing with, and just, maybe somebody who's gone through something similar can be very helpful. Again, expecting the unexpected, seeking professional support with a grief counselor. And many of our hospices in Ottawa here offer free grief counseling, or very cost efficient grief counseling, such as offered through BFO. can be very helpful. And finally, just supporting others in grief if you're in that category. So often we hear, call me if you need me. And I think it's pretty rare that people reach out because they don't want to be a burden. And so one of the things I often say to people supporting others in grief is repeated offers of assistance. So keep checking in, and just a simple, how are you? Nothing else. Or what can I do? Or I'd like to come over and drop off something for you, like something really definitive. And then they can say yes or no. But showing up, shoveling somebody's driveway, picking up some groceries and just dropping them off with no expectation of a thanks or acknowledgement can be just so welcomed by people in grief. So this really brings me to the end of my presentation. Some parting thoughts for those of you who have appreciated or learned from what I had to say. Wanted to let you know that I am on social media, Instagram, Facebook, LinkedIn. I also publish a monthly newsletter, not always on grief. It can be on pretty much anything under the sun, but I do post that on those sites. So on Facebook and LinkedIn, you can find that newsletter, or you can email me and ask to be added. My email address is right there. And at this point in time, I really just want to say that I hope you found what I had to say helpful. I really think we are fortunate to be together and brought together by bereaved families. And I just again wanted to thank bereaved families for the opportunity to speak. I also want to remind everybody that Bereaved Families is looking for members to join their board of directors, and that because they are a nonprofit, that donations are welcome and appreciated to fund the wonderful work that they do. So many of us are here as volunteers, but we want to be able to give more to our community. And so just reminding everybody that there's a huge demand for mental health and grief support service at this time. So again, I just wanted to thank you. I wanted to wish you all peace and God bless you and your loved one. And I'll open up the floor now for a very brief question period.